Hello there, and a very good evening to what would possibly be the final edition of Vantage Point with Dr. Dayan Jathalika. The reason being, he is now not only Dr. Dayan Jathalika, he is Ambassador Designate Dr. Dayan Jathalika. Very good evening, Doctor.
Good evening, Zulfi.
And congratulations on your new appointment and your re-entry into the diplomatic corps.
Thank you. It's nice to be back in diplomacy.
So, Doctor, let's start off with your appointment. How does it feel to be an ambassador once again, especially being an ambassador to one of the world powers, Russia?
Well, the last time I was ambassador, it was also to one of the permanent members of the Security Council, that's France, one of the P5. But now I think it's a step up. I shall be Sri Lanka's ambassador to Russia, the Russian Federation. And at this moment, when Russia is playing such an important role in the world arena, with Russian assistance, the Syrian state has almost won the intense civil war that was raging in that country with much international interference. And with President Putin in charge of Russia, it will be fascinating for me as a political scientist and international relationist and a former diplomat. But it is important also for Sri Lanka, and that is going to be my priority. We've had a very good ambassador before me, Dr. Saman Veerasena, who was a Russian speaker and is married to a Russian lady, and he did a great deal to build up our relationship with Russia. President Sirisena had a state visit to Russia. I met President Putin. It's my duty to take it to the next level. And I'm glad that in the run-up to my assumption of this post, Russia sent a high-level military technical cooperation delegation met with President Sirisena and also with our defense people. And Sri Lanka has now decided on expanding our defense ties with Russia in terms of training, equipment. It's multi-spectrum. So the Sri Lankan state, before my appointment, has already decided to strengthen the relationship with Russia, which I think is extremely wise, because Russia is a power that is working for global equilibrium, which is good for small countries like ours. It's always better for us to diversify our dependence rather than count on just one or two countries. The Russian military is very strong, and Russia has been a firm friend of Sri Lanka for a very long time. It has never, ever faulted us or tried to interfere with our internal affairs, told us what we should do. Russia has been a firm friend, as has China. And I think that I'm privileged to be able to represent our country, Sri Lanka, in Russia at this stage of the relationship between our two countries.
So, Doctor, now since you're going to be the new ambassador to Russia, have you been given any mandated tasks to perform by the government?
Well, I was appointed by President Sirisena, and obviously when he asked me whether I would like to serve in that capacity, he had already indicated to me the nature of his interaction with President Putin and the direction in which he saw relations evolving. So in that sense, yes, I have a briefing, but I'm also meeting people in the state across the spectrum. And I have a very clear idea from President Sirisena as to what he wants me to deliver in terms of specific outcomes, objectives and targets. Yes, I have a fairly clear idea what the head of state and head of government, my appointing authority, wants me to do in Russia.
So what would be your main primary task, Doctor, once you go there? Because we've had this, recently we had this issue with tea, where they tried to suspend the importation of Sri Lankan tea and then that whole saga surrounding it. So what would your primary focus be on right now?
Well, I don't think the tea issue was the fault of the Russian Federation. I'm not saying it was the fault of the Sri Lankan government, but some bug got in at some point.
Somewhere down the line that there was a bug.
Yeah. So the Russians were very careful and that's how that issue took place. I don't think it was a move on the part of any country at all. But my task will be to expand and strengthen and expand Sri Lanka's relations with Russia in as many dimensions as possible, including the intellectual, the academic, the cultural, the political, and obviously the military technical aspect. So broad spectrum upgrading of our relationship with Russia, which is already a relationship of friendship. My task will be to make it even broader gauge, a relationship than it is now.
Fascinating stuff there, Doctor, and congratulating you on behalf of the entire Capital Maharaj organization for your new appointment as the ambassador
Thank you.
for the
I
Russian
just
Federation.
paid a call on your chairman this morning, and we had a good chat. Yes.
So, Doctor, let's shift gears to local politics now. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, it's making a lot of talk around in many political fora and many diplomatic corps as well as in social circles. The 19th Amendment, Doctor. Now, there is for and against. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Zulfik, as a diplomat,
yes, Doctor,
I will have to sound different from the manner in which I spoke during the last 5 years. Well, what I can say is that this is part of our constitution, and it must not be overinterpreted or underinterpreted. It is what it is. If one chooses to amend it, then there is a procedure. For instance, the term limits and so on. One either has to go to the courts and get a ruling, or one has to attempt to revise the 19th Amendment, which requires the numbers to do that. So this is one aspect of it. Now, the 19th Amendment must not also be overinterpreted. We are still very much a presidential system. It's not the presidential system that existed under the 18th Amendment, which was an over-centralized system. There is a debate on whether we have gone back to the pre-18th Amendment executive presidency, or whether the executive presidency has been pretty much abolished, whether it's just nominal, as whether it's a non-executive presidency, as Dr. Nihal Javikrama has opined recently. I would say that the somewhat dramatic mini narrative about my own appointment, the political battles that went on for an extended period of time, which is quite unprecedented, I'm told.
Indeed.
The newspapers say this. I think the way it wound up shows whether or not we still have an executive presidency.
So interesting thoughts there, Doctor. We will continue this discussion right after this short commercial break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vantage Point. If you're just joining us, our guest today is not just Dr. Dayan Jayatillaka, it's Ambassador Designate Dr. Dayan Jayatillaka. Doctor, we were talking about the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and you likened it to somewhat your appointment as well. Let's talk about that. There was a huge saga surrounding your appointment, for and against. It went on for some time. There were even signatures for petitions. What's all this about?
Well, you know, I do have an ego, but it's not large enough for me to think that all of this was about me, or even primarily about me. If I were more egoistic than I actually am, I could say, well, 105 NGOs involving some heavy hitters in the NGO world, together with Mr. Sumandaran and a faction of the JVP, took their best shot. According to the newspapers, this was unprecedented, this tug of war. It was profiled in newspapers, including quality newspapers. It was profiled as the High Posts Committee rejecting the president's envoy, which was absolutely untrue. the story was spun that there was a majority of the High Post Committee against me, which was absolutely untrue. There was always a majority representing the main parties, the UNP, the SLFP, and the joint opposition in support of me. Certainly, the UNP did not oppose me at any point. In the last session, Vijayadasa Rajapaksa, the minister representing the UNP, spoke up very strongly on my behalf, and I knew how strongly only when I read a weekend newspaper which criticized him for doing so, a paper called Anidda.
Okay.
So the UNP supported me, the SLFP, Dr. Sarat Amanugama, supported me very strongly, and obviously Dinesh Gunawardena of the joint opposition was robustly supportive of me. So we had, in fact, the rarest of things, a multi-party consensus supporting me. But Mr. Sumandaran of the TNA, probably not entirely representative of the view of the TNA, because I spoke to Mr. Sambandan at the 91st anniversary of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and he didn't seem to know what had gone on. And your friend and mine, Professor Rajiva Vijayasinghe, had also spoken to Mr. Sambandan at the Swiss National Day, and Mr. Sambandan had said that Mr. Sumandaran's opposition to me was not consequent to a decision taken by the Tamil National Alliance.
Seems like it was an independent decision.
Well, I don't know about independent, but he...
Or his personal decision.
That I don't know, but he does not seem to have been voicing the views of the TNA, going by what Mr. Sambandan told me and Professor Rajiv Vijayasinghe. And then there was this faction of the JVP, Bimal Ratnayaka, Vijita Herath. So the battle was fought, it stretched out, it was unprecedented, and they lost. So yes, I could deliver, gain some modest satisfaction, but I don't think this was primarily about me at all. I think I was caught in the crossfire of two Cold Wars that are going on. One is the big Cold War, the new Cold War, against China and Russia, because Russia is the main ally of China, and there's a Eurasian counterweight, which is very helpful to small countries like Sri Lanka. And there are those who are opposed to Russia and China.
More West-aligned.
Well, they didn't want to see me as Sri Lanka's ambassador to Russia, because they thought that the ties with Russia will be strengthened, which of course they will. Now, by the strangest of coincidences, 1 week after the newspapers billed it as 105 civil society personalities signed petition calling on the government to withdraw its nomination of Dr. Dayan Jayatillaka as Sri Lanka's ambassador to Russia, came the news, also in the newspapers, that a certain agency had granted 10 million US dollars, that's 1.5 billion Sri Lankan rupees, to civil society organizations.
1.5 billion?
1.5 billion rupees. Let's be charitable. 10 million US dollars was the grant. The people who granted the money, can't help the value of the rupee. They'd given 10 million US dollars. Now, I'm not saying it had anything to do with the petition against me. But coincidentally, it was a week after that petition. So one of my friends, who was a senior person in Sri Lankan politics, actually called me and said, Dan, you're a bit of a fool. I said, why? Because I don't regard myself as one. He said, you should, these diplomats lunch with you. Why didn't you just indicate that $1 million and you will stay at home? You won't go to Moscow. They could have saved $9 million, given you $1 million. But you're the sort of idiot who doesn't do that sort of thing. So, the NGOs that signed that petition were functioning as mercenaries. Never have I seen 105 NGOs signing a petition calling on the government not to appoint somebody as ambassador, unless that person, is not credentialed or hasn't, I've served as ambassador twice, and I'm known. There were no charges, even in the NGO petition. There was nothing about malpractices.
No substantial
No,
allegations.
it was political. It was all about Geneva
Oh, I see.
and as the island editorial said, but he's not going to Geneva, he's going to Russia. I mean, what's
Indeed, Geneva, Russia, two different places.
Okay, he's being critical of the West, but that won't be a problem. He's being sent to Russia, he's not being sent to the West. Hello. I think it was part of the new Cold War. They just did not, apart from the obvious thing of why send him as ambassador, you haven't appointed any of us even as ambassador to the Maldives. And we are the ones who, worked for you. He's a critic. That's the obvious level of at one level, that's the issue. Pure resentment of petty minds. But there's another more serious issue. The serious issue is they didn't want somebody with my views going as Sri Lanka's ambassador to Russia.
Right.
Because they think that I will strengthen the ties between President Sirisena and the Putin administration and between Sri Lanka and Russia, which they don't want. And they also think that there'll be a third leg of the triangle, because one of the things in the petition was my support for former President Mahinda Rajapaksa. So they think that there will be some kind of triangle: President Sirisena, former President Rajapaksa, President Putin. Now, it's all very flattering, but this is the apprehension. Otherwise, why this unprecedented fuss over me? I'm not the guy in Qatar. Or wherever that scandal is.
Exactly.
And I'm not trying to sell MiGs. And what's the problem? So it was that it was the case, I believe, as one of my sources told me. They wanted somebody who would be ambassador in Moscow, but who would be basically spying on the Russians and reporting to the people that these NGOs actually get their money from and work for. And those are people who already have a problem with Russia and write to the Sri Lankan papers, which they shouldn't, against a third country. You're not supposed to. Now, I would not dare, as Sri Lanka's ambassador to Moscow, write articles to the Russian newspapers criticizing a third country. But there are those who do that in our town. And these are the people who fund these civil society organizations to the tune of, tens of millions, billions of rupees. So that's what this was about. And then they had their proxies in Parliament. Because, when you have 1.5 billion rupees, you can get yourself a few proxies. And this is the danger. Now, I do think that civil society has a role. I was a vice president of the UN Human Rights Council, and civil society has a role in the UN Human Rights Council, but they can't vote. The NGOs can speak for 2 minutes in the Human Rights Council, but you don't hold up the council saying, look, NGOs have issued this statement and we should discuss this and we should get them to come and testify and so on, and somebody else says, no, your duty is just to advise and give consent and so on. You don't have that, because if you allow the Human Rights Council to function that way, or the Parliament to function that way, then anybody can give money to the NGOs, who can then be asked to send a petition against anything or anyone and hold up a process, including an appointment. Now, Sri Lanka hasn't had an ambassador in Moscow, a very important part of the world, for many, many months. It's bad for Sri Lanka.
Indeed.
But you can hold this up by some unaccountable foreign-funded NGOs sending a petition, and somebody in Parliament deciding that, well, we should, take this very seriously. Now, it's one thing to take it on board and ask the person concerned, hey, what do you have to say about this? But I had sent in my response within 2 hours of receiving the NGO petition. I had sent it in to the relevant body. Now, that having been done, why protract the process saying the NGOs are saying this? It can go on forever. It's not just my appointment, any decision can be held up. All you have to do is
send a petition.
Send a petition or pay for a petition to be sent.
Some interesting thoughts there, Doctor. And a really good insight on what actually happened with your appointment.
There's a second aspect, if I may.
Doctor, shall we continue with that
Yes,
discussion
fine.
right after this short commercial break? We'll be right back. Welcome back to Vantage Point. Doctor, you were continuing on the saga behind your appointment where the petition was sent by NGOs.
Yes.
Shall we further elaborate on that?
Yes, well, that was my first point. Non-governmental organizations must not think that they are the government. And the government must not think that non-governmental organizations are the government or have veto power over the decisions of a government, still less the decisions of a directly elected executive president. So there are those who are trying out a new model, a new interpretation of the Sri Lankan political system after the 19th Amendment, which is actually not true. And this is my second point. I said I was caught in the crossfire of two Cold Wars. The first is the anti-Russian, anti-Chinese Cold War. The second, of which you have local mercenaries and clans. And you have local patrons as well. The second, and it's not unconnected, the second is the Cold War against President Sirisena.
Right.
Because if you take the most dramatic recent event in international politics, as far as I'm concerned, it's the near victory of the Syrian government in the externally supported Syrian civil war. And there were two key players apart from President Assad. One is President Putin of Russia, and the other is the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, few people remember that the president of Sri Lanka, Maithripala Sirisena, has been the guest of, has met with, and has warm relations both with President Putin and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Though he was warned by powerful ambassadors based here not to go to Iran, he went to Iran. And he had this discussion with Supreme Leader Khamenei. So, whatever you think about domestic politics and domestic policies, in international policy, in foreign policy, President Sirisena belongs to a long tradition, which has nothing to do with the UNP and the SLFP, cuts across both, of pro-third world, pro-multipolarity, independent foreign, an independent foreign policy, a non-aligned foreign policy. Therefore, he is being targeted. Therefore, there's a Cold War against him, including within the system, but launched from so-called civil society platforms. So, there's an attempt to sabotage every decision of President Sirisena and pull him down. The battle over my appointment was part of that attempt at sabotage.
Right.
But he prevailed. So, this is not simply or primarily or centrally about the controversial Ambassador Dayan Jayatillaka. It's about something much bigger that's going on.
Much bigger that we will have to keep our eyes out for.
Yes.
And Doctor, it's been a privilege having you here on our show for the past 5 years. And we thank you for giving your wonderful insight and critique and expertise.
Thank you.
As well as, based on your experience, what this country actually needs. So we thank you for that. Thank you for joining us on Vantage Point.
I've enjoyed it. It's been a privilege. I shall miss it.
And we also wish you every success in your new appointment as Sri Lanka's new ambassador to the Russian Federation. And may you bring close ties between Sri Lanka and Russia. And with that, we wrap up this edition of Vantage Point. And thank you very much for being with us for the past 5 years. And we leave you with the words of someone that is very dear to us, someone who we admire the most. And those words are, you either lead, follow, or get out of the way. And with that, we wrap up Vantage Point. Have yourself a wonderful evening.